The call came in at 2:47 on a Wednesday afternoon, right as I was walking out of Grand River Hospital after a 12-hour shift. Fern's name lit up my screen, and I almost smiled. She called from her watch, sometimes, just to tell me something funny her teacher had said, or to ask whether we could have macaroni for dinner. But then I heard it. That particular kind of crying that comes from somewhere deeper than a scraped knee. Breathless. Terrified. "Mommy. Uncle Duncan says we don't live there anymore. He put my backpack outside." I stopped in the middle of the parking lot. The February wind came off the field behind the hospital, and I didn't feel it. "He says," and then her voice dropped, like she was trying to hide even from the air around her. "He says this is his house now, that we have to go." And then I heard him. Duncan's voice, somewhere nearby, low and flat. "Fern, put that down." The line went dead. I had worked 12 hours straight. I hadn't eaten since 5 in the morning. I was standing in a parking lot in Kitchener, Ontario, and I could not make a single part of my body move. Duncan had been planning this for a long time. Months, probably. Maybe longer. He'd thought through most of it, the timing, the paperwork he planned to wave around, the way he'd frame the whole thing to the family. What he hadn't thought through was a 5-year-old girl who had her mother's number on her wrist, and an indoor security camera he'd completely forgotten about, tucked against the bookshelf in the living room, pointed at the front door. The kind that backs itself up to the cloud the second it detects motion. That camera had been running the entire day. But I'm getting ahead of myself. None of this came out of nowhere. It never does. My name is Freya. I'm 31 years old. I work as a registered nurse at Grand River Hospital, and my daughter Fern is 5. She has her father's eyes, gray-green, serious when she's concentrating, bright when she's about to say something she thinks is hilarious. She talks to her stuffed penguin before bed. She insists on having her sandwiches cut diagonally, because squares are for babies. Her father's name was Ronan. He died 18 months ago on a Thursday evening in August when a transport truck ran a red light at Highway 8 and King Street. He was 34. He'd been on his way home from the hardware store with a new set of drawer pulls for the kitchen renovation we'd been putting off for 3 years. The house was Ronan's before it was ours. He bought it in 2018, a semi-detached on Sterling Avenue in the east end of the city. 3 bedrooms, a backyard with a single maple tree that turns absolutely stunning in October, a basement that floods slightly every spring. When we married in 2020, we updated the deed to include my name. When he died, his will, drafted with a lawyer in 2021, signed and witnessed properly, filed through probate with the court, left the house to me and Fern outright. It was not a gray area. It was not a question. It was a legal document with his signature on it. Duncan knew this. He'd known since the estate was settled. It didn't stop him. To understand how any of this happened, I have to explain something about Ronan's family. His father, Clive, is a retired pipe fitter. Quiet, careful, a man who has spent most of his life deferring to whoever speaks loudest in the room. His mother, Noreen, filled that role without any apparent effort. She was not cruel, exactly. She was the kind of woman who had a reason for everything she wanted, and the reason was always some version of love. She could turn her own wishes into your obligation faster than anyone I'd ever met, and she did it with such warmth that you were halfway through agreeing before you noticed what you'd given away. And then there was Duncan. He's 41, 7 years older than Ronan was. He works in property management, which I mention because it matters later. He's always been the one in the family who speaks with authority about things he doesn't actually have authority over. Houses, money, what other people owe him. When Ronan was alive, he balanced it. Duncan would push, Ronan would quietly push back, and things stayed roughly where they should have been. When Ronan died, there was no one pushing back anymore, except me, and apparently, I didn't count. The first sign came 6 weeks after the funeral, when Duncan showed up unannounced on a Sunday morning. I was still in my housecoat. Fern was watching cartoons. He stood in my kitchen and told me, in a tone that was almost gentle, that he'd been thinking about my situation and that it might be worth having a conversation about what made sense for the house long term. I told him I appreciated the concern and that we were managing fine. He nodded slowly, like I'd said something naive. Ronan always said if anything ever happened to him, he'd want the house to stay with the family. You know how he felt about family. I remember going very still, because I knew what Ronan wanted. I had the document that said exactly what Ronan wanted, and what Duncan was describing was not it. The will is pretty clear, I said. He left the house to me and Fern. Duncan smiled. Of course, of course. I just meant when you're ready to move on, and I'm sure that's a long ways away, it would be nice to keep things local, in the family. I showed him to the door. But he didn't stop. Every few weeks, a new angle. Maybe I was finding the mortgage difficult to manage on one income. Maybe Fern would do better in a different neighborhood, something closer to her grandparents. Maybe I'd considered downsizing now that it was just the two of us. Every conversation was careful, deniable, never quite crossing a line, just pressing steadily against it. And then, Shona started coming with him. Duncan's wife Shona made small comments in a way that sounded like observation. She'd stand in my living room and say things like, "You know, this layout would open up so much better if you took that wall down." Or in my kitchen. I've always thought this house deserved more light. Not rudely, just proprietarily. The way you talk about a space you've already decided belongs to you. I noticed. I said nothing. I kept the peace the way I had been taught to keep it, which is to say I kept it until it cost me everything. The thing about Fern, what I couldn't explain away, was how she changed when Shona was around. She went quiet in a way that was different from her regular quiet. She stopped asking for things. She stayed close to me, her fingers tucked into the hem of my shirt. Once, when Shona reached over to tuck a strand of hair behind Fern's ear, Fern flinched. It was small. I almost missed it. I did not miss it. I asked Fern about it that night, soft and careful, the way you ask a small child something you need to know without frightening her. She looked at her penguin for a long moment. Then she said, "Aunt Shona says when you go to the hospital, you might not come back home." I sat with that sentence for a long time. I told Fern that wasn't true, that I always came back home, that there was nowhere I would rather be than right here with her. She nodded the way children nod when they want to believe something but aren't quite sure they should. I held her until she fell asleep, and then I sat in the dark and thought about what kind of person says that to a 5-year-old, and why. The next morning, I called the estate lawyer's office and asked them to prepare an updated summary of the probate documents. I'm not entirely sure what I was preparing for. I just knew I wanted them close. The week before everything came apart, my neighbor Muriel waved me down from her front step. She's in her late 60s, retired, and she misses nothing on our street. We'd swapped spare keys the previous winter so she could check the house during my overnight stretches at the hospital. "There was a man here Monday," she said, her voice low even though no one was nearby, "and again on Tuesday. Rang the bell both times, parked out front for a while each time. I hadn't been home Monday or Tuesday. I'd been on the ward." She described Duncan. I put my key in the door and stood in my own entrance for a moment, looking at things without touching anything. The coat rack, the bookshelf, the kitchen where Fern's drawings were taped to the fridge in overlapping layers. Nothing looked wrong, but something felt like it had already been measured in my absence, and a decision had been made that I wasn't part of. On Wednesday morning, I dropped Fern at school and drove to the hospital. It was a regular day. I had regular patients. I ate a granola bar at 11 and thought about what I'd make for dinner. I did not know that while I was checking charts, Duncan had let himself into my house with a key Noreen had apparently made during one of their visits. I'd left my keys on the counter once, months before, and I should have paid more attention afterward. I did not know he and Shona had spent the morning moving through my rooms. I did not know Noreen had already called 2 of Ronan's cousins to tell them Duncan was protecting the family property. What I found out at 2:47 was that my daughter was frightened, And a man in my house was telling her she didn't live there anymore. I called Fern's watch 3 times on the drive, no answer. I texted Duncan. One word. Stop. He replied 14 minutes later, she's fine, we'll discuss this like adults. Like adults. As if what was happening was a disagreement over where to hold Easter dinner. I drove to my street in 23 minutes and parked in front of my own house and sat in the car for 30 seconds because I needed to arrive level. I needed to be the version of myself that was going to win this. My key didn't fit. He'd changed the locks. I stood on my own front porch and my key didn't fit, and Fern's backpack was on the railing, with her water bottle still clipped to the strap, and my daughter was not there. Muriel was already crossing the street. They left about 40 minutes ago, she said quietly. Fern was crying. I should have called you the moment I saw them arrive. You couldn't have known, I said. I meant it. I called the police. The officer who arrived was clear and patient. The house was in my name. I had the title, but because Duncan had gained access without forced entry and had changed the locks, there were civil procedures that would need to run their course before removal. He could see this information landed badly. He let it settle before he said the rest. But my daughter, he said, was different. There was no custody order, no court document giving anyone else the right to withhold Fern from me. That was not a civil matter. He helped me get her back within the hour. She was at Noreen's, still in her coat, her eyes red and swollen. When she heard my voice in the hallway, she was running before anyone could think to stop her. She hit me at full speed around the knees and held on with both arms like she was keeping us both from floating away. Noreen stood in her kitchen doorway. You need to settle down, she said. Duncan is trying to help. You can't manage that house on your own, Freya. You know that. We all know it. Clive sat in the living room with his hands on his knees and said nothing. Duncan stood just behind Noreen, arms folded. Ronan would have wanted the house to stay with the family, he said. You know that's the truth. And there it was. That sentence, the one he'd been building toward for 18 months. Ronan would have wanted, as if he knew Ronan better than the man's own will. I picked Fern up. She pushed her face into my neck. We'll resolve this where it actually counts, I said. Not here. I walked out with my daughter, and I did not look back. I booked us into a hotel in Waterloo that night, and while Fern ate room service toast and watched something about talking trains, I opened my phone and I started making a list. Not of feelings, of facts. The will, the probate order, the title. The 17 text messages Duncan had sent me over the past year, ranging from mild suggestions to a message sent late on a Saturday 3 months ago that said, plainly, "This house was never meant for you. It was always supposed to stay in the family. Ronan told me so years ago." I had saved every one of them without knowing exactly why. I know why now. And then I remembered the camera. I'd installed a small indoor security camera the winter before Ronan died, mostly for overnight shifts, to check on Fern when a babysitter was watching her and I couldn't get to my phone. It sat on the third shelf of the living room bookcase, partially behind a ceramic bowl Ronan had made during a pottery class he took for exactly 1 month in 2019. The camera connected to an app on my phone, motion detection, automatic cloud backup. Duncan had been in that house dozens of times. He had walked past that shelf dozens of times. He had never once looked at it. I opened the app in the hotel room with Fern asleep beside me, and I scrolled through 41 recordings from that day, starting at 10:14 in the morning. I will not describe all of them. Some of it I've only watched once. In clip 12, Duncan walked slowly through my living room on his phone, the way he did when he was pleased with himself, saying to whoever was listening, "The lawyer can't touch it until she takes it to court. By the time she gets there, we'll have 3 months of occupancy. That changes everything." In clip 22, Shona was in Fern's bedroom. She was folding Fern's clothes, not into Fern's dresser, but into a bag she'd brought herself, and she was talking under her breath, just barely caught by that microphone. "We'll redo this room, something more neutral, more grown-up." In clip 31, Noreen came through the front door, carrying a casserole dish and a set of folded towels, and she said to Duncan cheerfully, as if she were commenting on the weather, "I still can't believe she didn't push back harder when you said it was the family's. Some people just don't have any spine at all." Some people. That was me. I sat in a hotel room in Waterloo, Ontario, and I watched 41 clips. Then I emailed everything, every clip, every timestamp, to myself, to my estate lawyer, and to a backup address I hadn't opened in 2 years. And then I called the lawyer directly, who answered despite it being nearly 7 in the evening. He was not surprised. He had been waiting for something like this, he said carefully. He already had everything we needed. 2 weeks later, Noreen called to invite me to the dinner she held every year on the anniversary of Ronan's accident. Her voice was warm. "The whole family will be there. We'd love to have you and Fern. It's time we cleared the air, as a family. For Ronan." "We'll be there," I said. I let every one of them believe I was coming to lay down my arms. The dinner was at Clive and Noreen's house in Cambridge. The table was set with the good dishes. There were relatives I hadn't seen since the funeral, Ronan's uncles, 2 cousins, a great aunt who had driven in from out of town. A framed photo of Ronan sat on the sideboard, the one from our wedding, and it took everything I had not to look at it for too long. Fern stayed close all evening. She would not go to Duncan when he crouched down and opened his arms. She turned away and took my hand more tightly. Everyone saw it. Nobody said anything. After dinner, after Noreen's small speech about remembering Ronan, after the tea was poured, Duncan stood up. He had a folder. He had actually brought a folder. He talked about family and legacy, and what Ronan would have wanted. He talked about the house on Sterling Avenue as if he were its rightful steward. He talked about my hours, my income, my inability to manage. His voice was measured, authoritative, reasonable, in the particular way of someone who has rehearsed. The room listened. He said he'd consulted a lawyer who believed the family might have legitimate grounds. He said it was about honoring Ronan. He said, and I have not forgotten this, Freya knows, in her heart, that this isn't the outcome Ronan would have chosen. The room waited for me to crumble. I didn't. I waited exactly 4 more seconds. Then I opened my bag and set my phone on the table, face up. Beside it I placed the probate order, the deed, the estate lawyer's signed letter, and the printed transcript of 17 text messages. Before anyone in this room decides what Ronan would have chosen, I said, I'd like everyone to hear what was happening in my house the day the locks were changed. Noreen began to speak. I pressed play before she could. Duncan's voice filled the room. The lawyer can't touch it until she takes it to court. By the time she gets there, we'll have 3 months of occupancy. That changes everything. The room went very quiet. I played the clip of Shona in Fern's bedroom, talking to herself about redecorating, folding my daughter's clothes into a bag she had brought specifically for this purpose. Then I played clip 31. Noreen's voice, warm and completely certain. I still can't believe she didn't push back harder. Some people just don't have any spine at all. The great aunt set down her cup. I slid the lawyer's letter to the center of the table. The house was left to me and Fern by Ronan's will, filed with the court. The deed is in my name. The mortgage is in my name. There is no ambiguity anywhere in these documents. There never was. I looked at Duncan. He was staring at my phone, not at me. I'm not taking this to court, I said. I don't need to. But I need every person at this table to understand what was being planned for my daughter, while she was being told that her mother wasn't coming back. Fern had been sitting quietly in the chair beside me the whole time. Now she looked up at me, and then around the table at all the faces, and she tugged my sleeve the way she did when she had something important to say. Can we go home, Mommy? Not a speech, not anger, just a small girl who knew which house was hers. The room broke the way. Rooms break when the thing no one wanted to say out loud has finally been said. Slowly, without fanfare, without any single dramatic moment. One of Ronan's uncles pushed back from the table and walked to the window. The great-aunt pressed her hand flat to her sternum. Clive, who had not spoken all evening, put his face in his hands. Duncan stood. He walked to the sideboard, picked up his folder, stood there holding it for a moment. Then he set it back down without a word and went to get his coat. Shona followed. The front door opened. It closed. No one stopped them. Noreen sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her, looking at Ronan's photo on the sideboard. No apology, no explanation. Just silence where all her certainty used to be. One of Ronan's cousins, a woman named Carries, who'd been a witness at our wedding, and whom I had always genuinely liked, came around the table and put her arms around me without a word. She held on for a moment and stepped back. Then she knelt down to Fern's level. "Your daddy would be so proud of your mum," she said. Fern considered this seriously. "She had the videos," she said. We drove home on the 401 in the dark, and Fern fell asleep before we reached the Waterloo exit. I carried her inside still in her coat, settled her in her bed with her penguin, and stood in her doorway for a long moment, just listening to her breathe. The locksmith I'd hired that afternoon, my own, no connection to anyone else in this situation, had rekeyed every lock before I left for dinner. My key worked, my door was mine again. What came after was slower and quieter than what came before. It usually is. Duncan never contacted me again directly. His lawyer apparently reviewed the documents and advised him he had no case. I believe it. The estate lawyer sent a formal letter to his address, confirming that any further interference with the property would result in legal action. That was the end of it, on paper. Clive called a week later. He was brief and halting in the way men like him are when they've decided to do something hard. "I didn't know the full shape of it," he said. "I knew Duncan had ideas about the house, and I should have stopped it long before it got to where it went. I chose not to make waves. That was wrong, and I'll be sorry about it for a long time. I'd like to still be Fern's grandfather if you'll let me. On whatever terms you set." The terms were simple, I told him. Everything in the open. Everything with me present and informed. No conversations with Fern I didn't know about. No visits to the house without my knowledge. He took the terms. He comes every other Sunday now and pushes Fern on the swing Ronan built the spring before he died. And he is patient and steady. And he is earning something small back one afternoon at a time. Noreen called twice. The first time she left a message about how difficult the whole ordeal had been on her. The second time, she asked when she could see Fern. She did not mention the recording. She did not mention telling a room full of family that I had no spine. She was sorry for what had happened to her. She was not sorry for what she had done to me, or to her granddaughter. I did not call back, I haven't. The camera is still on the bookshelf. I check it sometimes out of habit, the way you test a smoke alarm, not expecting anything, just confirming the protection is there. Most of what it records now is Fern building elaborate cushion forts and explaining the rules of some complicated game to her penguin. I hope that's all it ever captures again. She doesn't ask anymore whether we're still going to live here. She used to ask, at bedtime every few weeks, the question coming out small and careful. Each time I'd say always, always this house. Always her room, her backyard, the maple tree that goes red in October. Last week she asked me to tell her the story of how her dad chose the house. She loves the part where he walked up the front steps and said, "This is the one." She loves it, because she says she can tell, just by looking at the steps, that he was right. I think she's right too. Ronan used to say that a house is just the excuse. What you're actually building is the life inside it. I understood that as a nice thing to say. I understand it differently now, after watching someone try to strip away the life and leave only the building standing. You can change the locks. You can carry someone's things out in boxes and call it tidying. You can stand in a room full of family and speak with such authority that everyone nods along. What you cannot do is walk into someone else's grief and call it an inheritance. You cannot tell a child her mother isn't coming back and expect that lie to hold. Children know which door is theirs long before they have words for it. Fern knows which door is hers. I know which door is mine. I knew it standing in a hospital parking lot in February with a dead phone call and a 12-hour shift behind me, with 23 minutes of driving ahead. I knew it every time I turned onto Sterling Avenue and saw the light on in Fern's window. Some things don't need a document to be true. But it helps to have one anyway.